Welcome to Cody in the Cinema. Today I'm discussing Mean Streets, the breakout movie from legendary director Martin Scorsese that Richard Linklater called the patron saint of independent filmmaking. This was the film that I believe has inspired many a great filmmaker who wants to work beyond the constraints of Hollywood or other agendas. And it is still so explosive and interesting and devastating in some ways to watch. And as a little side note here, I do love the 4K transfer from Criterion, especially in the restaurant scenes. So worth checking out if you haven't done that. But this is a world immediately in which we are exposed to violence, which is very organic and natural to people. In fact, it's almost unnatural when the screen is quiet and lacks the violence. Early in the movie, we see Harvey Keitel in church trying to find some kind of repentance, or so he says. And you wonder throughout the film, as he deals with Johnny Boy, if that is part of why he's so patient. Maybe. But what I like about the way that Scorsese tackles religion in his films is how realistic to how religion plays out in humanity. This isn't exactly the most self-improvement I have seen from a protagonist concerning religious ethics or morals. Like many people, Harvey Keitel simply wants to feel better. He is self-reflective, but he's also hypocritical, which some characters point out. And beyond that, he's not, as I said, essentially very self-improving. He keeps getting himself into trouble by doing things he shouldn't, which is shown greatly in an early scene where he's trying to do the candle fire trick, and he just keeps burning himself. I think that's such an effective image from Scorsese that communicates so well to the audience, especially since the flame itself is such a symbol of the Catholic faith. And he says early on, you can't mess with the infinite. It's not exactly how he says it, but such a, the flame ever burning. This sense that if he does too much bad stuff, the infinite will catch up with him. Which, in the beginning of the picture, we are in church, we're repenting, we're doing those things. And by the end, where are we? We're in a graveyard with Rob De Niro as he's spiraling out of control, playing terrifically the part of Johnny Boy. In the last picture that they go to see is Tomb of Ligeia, and they're literally like in a tomb, tombs, graveyards. Very intentional, I think, that religious imagery from Scorsese. A big question this film asks repeatedly is, to what extent can our relationships work with us and for us, and how can these relationships survive in the context of the mean streets of life, right? So there's most obviously Johnny Boy, who Harvey Keitel definitely should not be around. Definite bad influence, ropes him into trouble, of course, in the very end, the trouble that happens there. But this also comes up repeatedly with Teresa, who seems to be a pretty good girlfriend for him, I think. And the parts of the movie where those two interact and they have their conversations in the apartment, and then as they walk to the beach, so much of that reminds me very heavily of Godard's Breathless. I have the 4K here from Criterion. Just this sort of back and forth ennui with characters trying to figure out their lives. So much French New Wave in that. And it almost can, it can almost be a little bit like off-putting if you're not used to that style of cinema. And I love how Scorsese just takes elements like that and weaves them into his plots and his stories and his filmmaking. And I hadn't noticed that until I rewatched, because I've become such a fan of this film and French New Wave over the years that I really kind of took hold of that and appreciated that part. But, the relationship with Teresa isn't exactly allowed, right? And so much of what Charlie has to do is through the eyes of his uncle, Giovanni. And so everything that he makes as a decision is in service to that. And finally, something that's touched on a little less, but it is in the movie, is, how can people date in the face of prejudice in general, right? We see that with some of the African American characters, the Jewish characters. This world has enough prejudice that characters sometimes simply go along with it for the sake of expediency. Especially in that one scene where Harvey Keitel basically stands the girl up that he's supposed to help with the job. And it's really sad. It's a really sad part. Over and over, we see Scorsese play around with the tracking shot. And my favorite tracking shot, and I'd forgotten how far this goes. I always remember when there's the party for the veteran and Harvey Keitel gets completely plastered and the camera tracks him walking. But I've forgotten that it actually shows him not only kind of hobbling around, but collapsing to the floor. And it stays with him in his drunken state until, of course, he wakes up and he has another fight with Michael. And the thing about Michael and the thing about Harvey Keitel's character, Charlie, is they aren't really the best tough guys. They're not aggressive enough. The actual best tough guy is Johnny Boy. He just has no control, which we see a character like that later with someone like Tommy DeVito in Goodfellas, just completely off the hinges. And Teresa even is much more aggressive and doesn't seem to like the double standards of the streets and the world that Harvey Keitel finds himself in. She doesn't like that either. One of the things I've always loved about this movie, that I've always admired, is how Michael's patience wears out. He has a lot at first. He's selling cigarettes, giving cigarettes to Charlie, and scene by scene, you can see him lose patience with this payment, and he realizes it's starting to make him look bad as he goes along. But he's still not completely self-satisfied in this mean enforcer sort of role. I mean, even when he confronts Amy Robinson's character Teresa in the apartment about Johnny, or looks for Johnny, and he they stumble, and then she loses her groceries. He's like, what am I doing? I'm helping her pick these groceries up. Whereas Johnny Boy later, when she does have the seizure, he just walks awkwardly around her as if she's an annoyance, as if people are a commodity to him, as we find out. And it makes us much less sympathetic to the character, but they are. Even when he's egging on, Charlie to get his uncle involved to help with the debt, we figure out Johnny Boy's actually pretty selfish by the end of it. But he could have been very useful in their crime exploits. For example, early on, when they get in the fight in the pool room, who's the best character in that by a lot for actually standing up to this and rising up to the occasion? It's Johnny Boy, in one of the most entertaining scenes in the film. And the use of music, of course, always, it's just, Scorsese really innovated there in the way that he finds the perfect song, I think, for the perfect situation. Another film that it has an important role, I think, in this movie, and one that Scorsese loves and that I love, it's one of my favorite movies, if you can see it behind me, is The Searchers. Because when the first movie where the characters are in the cinema together, they are watching what I think is the worst part of this entire movie, a movie that I love, which is the fight scene. They're it's supposed to be comedic. It's so immature and it's so different tonally. And it's funny that the characters, that's the part, that's where they live. There's all this serious stuff going on in The Searchers. A house has been burned down, a girl's missing, conflict abounds, yet what part does Scorsese choose to focus on? The completely ridiculous comedic humor of the fight that they see in the theater, and the guys are laughing along with it, because it doesn't seem like anyone in this entire film ever really takes anything seriously enough until they do. And then at the end, of course, we have the water spout up out of the ground like Old Faithful in Yellowstone. Just phenomenal last image there as well. And I listened to some of the extras and have read the essay that's in here that accompanies this, that sort of explains more interpretations of this. Of course, the interview with Richard Linklater is where I got the opening quote in this video. That is worth seeing in the Criterion packaging, where Martin Scorsese talks about the extent to which this might be autobiographical. He's always been a little bit not as revealing with everything there. Kind of held some of that to privacy, which I appreciate. But it does feel as authentic as anything this filmmaker's ever made. And what I personally appreciate with my films is that they feel like they came from a person's experience. I don't have to have something like this just because like I'm a dude, you know. I don't have to have like tough guys yelling at each other, but I mean, it is appealing. And I think it's a good cautionary tale. I believe that we live in a world now where so many young men are so caught up in this kind of idea of perpetual violence and yelling and disorder that they can't even imagine a world without it. And I think that we have influences that are making that worse. And Scorsese has a number of these pictures that warn us that while this stuff can be pretty entertaining for a while, eventually something really bad happens that nobody wanted to have happen. Okay. One more little thought. This is a smaller thought, but especially if you have the 4K restoration, the scenes with Giovanni in the restaurant and so forth, those to me have aged as well as anything in the entire picture. But I love it in the 4K restoration. It really does look like something out of like The Conformist, okay, or some great Italian picture. Just beautiful scenes. And you kind of feel the regal, overwhelming, kind of godlike sense of Giovanni throughout the picture because he's so different than all these other hoodlums. And that part in this last viewing seemed especially significant because, you know, I'm no longer a young guy in my 20s. You know, when you're in your 20s, you might, like, as I said, you might kind of get into some of the rambunctious sort of nature of these people. But as you age, certain other characters really stick out to you, and that's one of them. In the end, I think this is one of the great films of Scorsese, and I hope that people who think he's just a gangster director will realize that a lot more is going on in his filmography than that, even though this is one of his premier gangster movies. And they will see all of his inspirations concerning cinema. You know, the work he's done in film preservation is just unmatched. There's a lot to dig into there that I didn't even go into, but those are my main thoughts I had on my current, most recent rewatch. So, do you like Mean Streets as much as I do? Do you enjoy another Scorsese picture? If you wouldn't mind, clicking the like button does grow the YouTube channel. Like buttons grow YouTube channels, and comments do too. Thank you for everyone who has chosen to subscribe. If you are enjoying that content, please do that as well. And we'll see you next time on Cody in the Cinema.